Tucson region for this, for the funding opportunity, right? And so this really is our chance to think about what are those strategies that we really want the continuum of care to think about as we move into the next phase of this work together. So lots of really great conversation today, and really appreciate everything that you all have brought forward in this last day and a half. And I just want to say again, thank you all so much as we begin in just a minute or so to move into the recap of our last bit of time together. I just want to personally thank you all so much for all the engagement that you all have. We even have a slide that proves how engaged y'all are. So I just want to say thank you. And do you have sliders for the?
Yes.
Oh, do you want to kick us off or do I?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So we had a day and a half or two days together for this forum, and we wanted to talk about what we learned and what we're going to do together next. So first, we want to thank you. You all met Brooke and Margaret, my colleague Ian. Again, we are all so pleased to have been able to share these last few days with you and to learn alongside you. Wanted to just again start by where we began, which is talking about Fuse and the Fuse overview. And again, one of the things that was so powerful to me about our ability to sort of link up the funding opportunity to the continuum of care and Fuse is that both are in these you're both in these planning and prioritization stages. So we're sort of here in this first phase for Fuse, right? We're in the planning, and we're really going to be thinking about what is our how are we moving into that implementation, right? How are we going to implement Fuse in our community? But we've got some planning to do first, and we started that yesterday and today. So we wanted to come back to this slide, right? Because we really wanted to recenter on who are we talking about, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about Fuse implementation and sort of these priorities in our community? So we have this slide, this wonderful slide that Ian shared with us about how these data can help us to tell a story, right? So in this example, we've got a person over a 2-year period who is going into the hospital 4 times. That same person is booked into jail 6 times. And then they're having engagements with the homeless response system or in emergency shelters. But when we look at each one of those separately, it doesn't look like too much. But when we look at that across sectors, right, and this is why these coordination conversations that we've been having, these data integration conversations we've been having are so important. Because as Ian reflected for us yesterday, these data are reflecting a person's experience, right? This is a person. This isn't data, these are people. And so when we have better information about people that we're engaging with, we have much better opportunity to have better outcomes. So again, just sort of wanted to recenter on why we're here, right? We're in that planning phase for the Fuse work. We want to start talking about our timelines. So we're going to outline some of those timelines. We want to think about who are we going to be outreaching to. So we've had some conversations in smaller groups and in larger groups about who do we need to still reach out to and connect with as we think about implementing a Fuse work group. And then, of course, establishing those work groups, right? We started the foundation of that over these last 2 days, and really setting forward that agenda and those meeting schedules, because we have a lot of work to do together. Ian, did we talk about who's taking water? Should you want me to just?
Good. Let me know. No,
Okay.
I can help you something.
So I wanted to again bring us back to our Fuse planning work groups, right? These are sort of the core groups that we think about when we're thinking about launching the Fuse initiative in a community. We've got that cross systems planning group, the sort of core steering group, data work group, housing and services, scaling and evaluation. So we started some of those conversations over the last 2 days. And we want to talk about also, you want to talk about?
Sure.
I knew we could prove that y'all are an engaged group of people.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your participation with Slido. I think it was a hit. This is sort of my take. I hope folks were able to engage with it. I think it'll prove incredibly helpful because all of those thoughts and questions and feedback are now recorded and can be used and analyzed, outside of these spaces, so that we don't forget or lose track of kind of what was said in these rooms over these 2 days. And so I just, I'm kind of obsessed with it. I really like it as an engagement tool, and just an additional way for people to be involved, and especially for folks who maybe are more shy and don't want to necessarily raise their hand, but hey, I'll put it on my phone. And so I just really thank you for it, and just thanks for hanging in there, because sometimes you feel like, but it seemed like it went well, so thank you.
And I appreciate having actually having these graphics and seeing the word clouds that come up here too, right? People, services, housing, community, right? All of these things really are exciting. So I wanted to kind of do a little bit of level setting that came up in a couple of our working groups yesterday that I was a part of. And there were a couple of themes that are just sort of non-negotiable as you start this work together, right? These are the things that sort of need to be included in every part of the work that you all are doing together. So the first one is making sure that people with lived experience are included in all of these conversations. Don was telling us earlier about how he was part of planning things, because he was early on in a program and he was part of the planning process. So this is exactly what we're talking about, right? Making sure that every group, all of the work that you're doing together is including and committed to incorporating lived experience and decision-making roles. So really just wanted to sort of set that as we go into this, sort of the themes that came up from the working groups and the next steps from the working groups, that these are sort of baked in to those processes. The other one is being racially explicit and including race equity in these conversations. Again, came up in these working groups and in all of the groups that you all were in as sort of these non-negotiables, right? So everyone agree with that? That these kind of two things are pretty baked into need to be baked into the work y'all are doing together. So Ian's going to talk about system modeling.
Yeah, so same expression of thanks and gratitude from Slido for those that participated in the system modeling session yesterday. Thanks for hanging in and taking a leap of faith with me about how we look at the system a little bit differently and how we define certain terms. I really appreciate everyone's engagement, thoughts, and perspectives. And so these were some of the themes that came out just from the agenda. where we translated from HUD speak to a much more maybe plain language reading of that definition of severe service needs. That I think will pay dividends as we, as you work through the NOFO, think about system modeling a little more deeply over the next couple of weeks and months. That'll help a lot, I think. We talked about population and who in our community may fit that definition of severe service need. How do we know? Not only through our data, but also through our eyes and our experiences, and that we shouldn't let data necessarily take over and be the only point of reference, but be one among many points of reference. And then we talked about pathways, another sort of HUD term about how people flow through the system. How do we think that our neighbors, our homeless neighbors, and unsheltered neighbors should flow through the system to get into housing, and how quickly that should be, and setting some benchmarks and standards for those programs and pathways. We opened the discussion a little bit about services and quality, and that sometimes it's not what is being offered, but also how services are being offered and what they look like, to make sure that they're adequate and satisfactory and meet the need of each individual. And then finally, we talked about paint fences. And I messed up a little bit versus month and year, but we got there just to talk about how much do we think things will cost. And it's certainly last but not least, and one of the more important facets of system modeling. So again, I really thank you for that. It was a really instructive exercise for me as well. And so, yeah, thank you.
And then for our group this morning, right, thinking about our priorities and our planning, right? So we talked about the funding opportunities available now. We kind of started thinking about what is that comprehensive planning going to look like, and we really talked about how the Fuse work is so well aligned with this funding opportunity, right? The priorities are so aligned with Fuse, right? Addressing unsheltered homelessness, using that housing first approach, right? Building out that data infrastructure and what capacity needs to be built there, advancing equity, including a really broad array of folks in the planning. So this is a really wonderful exercise today. Yesterday, we also had a sort of a cross-systems planning first conversation with a group of funders. And one of the most exciting things that we talked about in that group is that the city of Tucson is putting forward 100 housing choice vouchers to the Fuse initiative. And so this is going to be an incredible first resource. But as we've been talking about, and as the themes that have come up, not only in almost every session that we've had, is we can't have the housing only, right? We've got to have those services that go along with it. And so we're going to really this group is really going to need to think about how are we going to deploy that incredibly valuable resource, and how are we going to get the right array of services attached to that. We're gonna, this group really talked about continuing to develop that shared buy-in, right? That we got, we still got to get out to folks that we need at the table, that can fund some of this work, or that need to be involved in this work, and really think about Fuse as part of our homelessness reduction strategies for the community. Again, continuing to think about how do we identify and engage with organizations who are interested in supporting Fuse or are already engaged, and really making sure that those folks are part of this ongoing work. Another thing that we talked about in this group that came up in almost every other group is really thinking about how do these tie back to our existing housing supply. We talked a lot about feasibility. And just sort of like, it's great to have all these conversations around supportive housing development, but what if we don't have the affordable housing available, or what is that existing housing supply conversation look like? And so really thinking about how do we think about linking fuse as sort of a catalyzing opportunity to think about our housing supply and housing policy. And then we talked a lot about funding alignment. So we talked about how can various funding sources, whether it's philanthropy or whether it's county, city, business, how can we start to think about aligning those funding priorities? And we were talking about this also in a number of other another group. But we talked about it as singing from the same songbook, right? That we really need to get on a unified message, but we got to make it a banger. Yeah. Right? So the important thing is to have some diversity of the parts. So harmonize it rather than all doing the same thing. How are we supporting each other? And I thought this was a really wonderful way to describe that. So our next steps are going to be really thinking about a financial model. What is the ask, right? What are we talking about when we're talking about launching this initiative, and what are the resources that we need? So before we can go out and ask, we need to know what we're asking for. So part of the work of this group is going to be to really think about and working with CSH to think about how do we develop that financial model. And the other piece was that came up in this group was thinking about communicating and really sharing information with other groups, right? So hosting some information sessions and really making sure that we're all on the same page, that we're carrying this message forward and really securing those fused champions that are going to be needed to carry this work forward. We're gonna, they've committed to convening those ongoing meetings, right? To really get those set up, to start developing those agendas and get these tasks going. Oh, yeah.
No, I was gonna say, and then after each of the sessions, we're just gonna take a quick moment to just allow for anyone to provide additional feedback on what might be missing. Any other questions or considerations or thoughts that you might have? We just want to take a quick moment to just capture any other pieces that are remaining.
And I guess I want to take a minute too, because I noticed that there are some folks in the room that may just be here for this session and haven't necessarily. Is there anyone that hasn't been here? So we're using I don't know. You're more than welcome to just share feedback, but we're also using this Slido that can be used to put input in.
But it's, yeah.
They have additional thoughts, like put them in the Q&A, but I feel like they could fit in here too.
Oh,
yeah, sure.
Do you want to share them or do you want to do
Everything. It's just really from this.
sure. Yeah.
I've like 4 of them so far.
Oh. Anyone else have comments as we're pulling these up? This isn't exhaustive. This is your starting place. For quarterly updates, Jeff, we talked about this, and I think that that's a really important piece. So I really liked this one about emerging technology. I mean, I think that these are certainly part of that data infrastructure and data capacity conversation that we've been having. So now that this is here.
I think I think just from a communication standpoint, like the quarterly update piece, I think that's an important part of the planning process for each of the different groups. That like how do you want to how can you report to your constituencies, to the public, I think is really important and something to consider. I don't want to presume about intervals. Maybe it's more often. Maybe it's like, I don't think it could be necessarily less often if you really want to be responsive. So I think that's a really important part of the planning process, communication. And then as far as emerging technologies or advancing technology, I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really my wheelhouse. And I know that there's been a lot of connections made, like not necessarily personally by me, but just like seeing in the room the connections are being made along those data lines, particularly from university partners, or the university partner, I should say.
Our favorite
Yeah.
university partner.
So that was really, really good to see. Yeah.
And then, just thinking about sort of, views lighting the fire of change. I mean, you know, in some communities, it absolutely is. We talked about, we talked a lot about sort of how views can be used as a systems change, strategy, or an approach. And so, you know, is it the new norm? I mean, it is part of the work. Hopefully it will be part of the work that you are doing. And yes, the hope is that it does promote that sort of the systems change that we are all talking about today. That work is ahead of you. But I mean, ideally, you know, yes, right, that we talked about curved cuts, right, in our earlier conversation. And I think that really is sort of what we might be thinking about as we think about this, right? That as we implement a Fuse initiative, that's going to have broader effects for the population of people experiencing homelessness overall. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again.
Margaret, sorry, could you just read the question?
Oh, yeah. So the question is, how can we make Fuse come full circle by including investing in our community from organizations, committees, landowners, etc.? And I think, again, that's, you know, that is the work ahead. And I would say too that, again, it's like we're talking about a very specific population. So when we go back to who are we talking about when we're talking about a person who might be eligible for a Fuse initiative, we're really talking about that smaller group of people, right? So the question is, then how are we going to make sure that as we do those best practices for that group, that those best practices then are deployed across the system and sector? And so I think that is absolutely part of that scaling and evaluation conversation. But I would welcome others to reflect on that. Yeah.
My name is Sam Nagy, partner with an agency called Heart Hitters for the Kingdom and Socks to Serve. We're a nonprofit agency here in community Tucson here in King County, and we've been doing a lot of collaboration with the population here in Tucson, those experiencing homelessness. And I also work in behavioral health. And I think really the foundation of what I like to talk about, not long, don't worry, but it's just the fact that we're four guys who've all been in some type of incarceration situation. Some of us have been homeless, me and my three other partners, Danny, Joey, and Jonathan, and I. And we all just go out into the community and give back. And we have a website, helplesshelpothers.net. And I'm sorry I wasn't here yesterday. It got a little late today. I was working, but I really wanted to just hear more about what's going on. And but that's what our heart is to be able to give back to the community in a very special way. It's not difficult, but it takes effort. And I think with the partnerships is what I was going to say about the community of Tucson, because I've been here my whole life. And I really enjoy the collaboration we have, especially with TPCH and some of those that I didn't quite see the little letters up there. And also with the Community Foundation here. And I'm really blessed to be part of that. And we do what we can to help other people. And that's our goal every single day, every time we go out there into the community. And so just want to add about the nonprofits as well. We're a big part of this community as well. And there's a huge huge grouping of all of us together, and it's really nice to be a part of it, so.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We've actually had a lot of, when we look at who's in the room, most of them are service providers and direct service providers. So thank you for sharing that. And to your point, Jason brought up a really nice point earlier when we were talking about in our planning and priorities section, which is really thinking about sort of how do we sort of more effectively capitalize on all of the good work that's happening out there, right? And so really making sure that we're really paying attention to and sort of thinking about how we can better deploy resources and make sure that we're sort of using all of the great work and able to sort of deploy all the wonderful work that's happening out in the community. So again, thank you again for sharing that. You got another comment over here? Oh, are you sure you don't want me? You got it? I could just throw it to you. Yeah.
So I like the fact, for the people that didn't hear me introduce myself earlier, my name is Fiona Rose. I am a local youth activist. I'm also co-chair of TPCH Youth Action Committee, as well as Youth Collaboratory's Youth Catalyst team. One thing I did notice about the gentleman that spoke before, that there's like lived experience people who want to make change. And my thing is I want to bring more like representation of other groups that seem to be minimalized and stereotyped in the community, like bikers. Like there's a Sunriders MC, they do annual toy drive, they go to struggling families and give them money, they give them resources, they do Thirsty Thursdays where they cook food at their clubhouse and stuff. Like there's so many opportunities to collaborate amongst different communities. Like I feel like in the system's eyes, if it's not structured formally, then it's considered a gang, and then it's considered like bad, and it needs to go away. And like how like a lot of motorcycle clubs used to feed the homeless at parks and stuff, and then there ended up being that regulation where you can't feed people at parks no more. It's only these certain people can. It's kind of like creating these laws, shooing certain people away, and then shining the light on the people who are paying for these things to get done. So I feel like the Fuse Initiative is a really good opportunity to bring these frowned upon communities together and just creating a community from it, because frowning upon these things, that just creates more segregation, and this whole thing is about bringing everyone together. And that's what I look forward to. And I'm definitely more than willing to be an inclusive voice with that, because I have family that are in Sunriders and I have family that are homeless, and I'm lived experience myself, so I can advocate across all borders if you guys ever need me to. Thank you.
We also had started our scaling and evaluation work group yesterday. So we talked a lot about the evaluations that are currently in place. And it feels like, there's a lot of, we're capturing a lot of data about programs, and we're looking at these, we're looking at the system performance measures. So there are a lot of data and evaluations that we can sort of start to think about how we might use those. But we also talked about the fact that we might need other partners at the table that weren't there yesterday, particularly Access, or our state Medicaid agency. We also talked about including Banner or other health system partners, right? When we talk about Fuse, we're talking about healthcare, justice, homelessness, right? So making sure that we have all of those folks at the table. We also talked about how to develop that sort of shared vision, again, sort of, what is that shared vision for success? How are we going to measure that success, right? We talked about that there's a lot of data currently being tracked, but now we need to evaluate sort of how are those data being used, and importantly, how are they being used to inform investments, right? How are we using these data to decide what we're investing in, how we are investing our resources as a community? And then we also talked about data that maybe aren't currently being tracked, but should be. The one example that came up yesterday was mortality. So these are some of the themes that came up in our scaling and evaluation work group. And we talked about next steps. for this group, we talked about the need for high quality supportive housing, and that there's an opportunity to sort of build some capacity on what does it mean to deliver these supportive services in a way that are high quality, right? So we talked about, do all staff that are out there have access to mental health training or motivational interviewing or trauma informed care, harm reduction strategies, right? Some of the things that we've talked about today. So what is that, we talked about maybe exploring the feasibility of like a credentialing or sort of what might it look like to really build the capacity of our service provider community. We also talked about the need to set a new table. So we've got a lot of things going on, and there's a lot of things that are happening out in the community. But really thinking about this in relation to developing shared outcomes. And what might that look like when we've got people with different, or organizations with different interests? How can we come together and again develop that sort of shared vision? And can our favorite academic help us with that? Exploring the capacity of the University of Arizona to help facilitate that conversation. So we're not putting anyone, we're not committing anyone to anything, but we really are going to start those conversations and make some of those connections with these last 2 days. We also talked about the need to develop some guiding principles and some sort of shared values and a shared glossary of terms. And we talked about this because, again, sometimes when we're thinking about, we talk about this, we think about, we're again coming in with maybe different interests, different pressures from an organization, different priorities. We talked a lot about just sort of competing priorities. And so the idea of sort of having these guiding principles, these shared terms, can help not only as we think about what is our vision to do this work together, but also what do we mean when we say these words, right? We've talked a lot over the last day and a half about the sort of level setting on what do we mean when we say supportive housing, right? What do we mean when we say housing first? What does that really mean, right? Because I'm going to keep using this, but like you can ask 10 people what is supportive housing and you're going to get 12 answers. That was my favorite one. So really making sure that we're on the same page, right? Otherwise, our work is gonna it's not going to be as productive. I want to go back to Liz and how beautifully she started us off yesterday morning with these with this idea of this work that we're embarking on together, right? With that quote. So again, this can sort of help facilitate those conversations. Want to talk about how we can embed these outcomes in current and future dashboards. So again, we talked that there are some data captured already. There's some performance being measured already. So how can we think about sharing these fused outcomes in those existing and to be developed dashboards? And then again, of course, that sort of non-negotiable about including race equity evaluation. What did we miss? That's just one of the things that we want to always talk about when we're talking about these, evaluation of scale, is that having these evaluations and sort of knowing how well we're progressing is really foundational to our ability to secure additional resources to show funders in the community this is working and how it's working. So that we can really have those validations and really make sure that we can show our successes and measure and evaluate our successes so that when we need additional resources for scaling your youth initiative, oh, this was a good one. Communities outside of, in Tucson, but outside of Tucson. Yeah, how about, we were talking earlier about how do we use our voices? Yeah.
With that evaluation
Yeah.
to leverage everybody in the room and everybody that's involved on helping move some of those funding sources that we may need to move with our representatives.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of, you're singing from the same song, but make it a banger.
Okay.
Right? Like, I feel like that's kind of like how can we strategize to use all of those, right? And we had a really good strategy earlier this morning, right? When we're talking about sort of like, hey, it's not just, like, let's really think outside the box and sort of think about those creative strategies. So, but it's a unified message, but it's in harmony.
And moving people to get that message.
Yeah. Great point. Yeah, it's also some barriers with the public. A hard one. I think it's very disruptive. Not so easy to hear what's not going on. Outside of justice and healthcare, that's a great comment. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, right? Either sort of the what else would you add outside justice and healthcare? What other sectors would you add?
I typed this in for like my browser address, so I don't think it went through. But I was mainly wondering like what's the Board of Education thought on this, because a lot of youth they tend to open up about these certain topics at school with a trusted adult, and a lot of I was in an ed change meeting with Victoria, and the people we were speaking with were talking about a lot of the counselors and stuff don't know what to do, and they're not even aware of the key mental. So like I feel like the Board of Education should be a part of this conversation, especially with youth facing homelessness and disclosing it at school, because a lot of youth talk about a lot of issues at school and they don't know what to do.
Okay. So we had our data work group this morning. And I think the conversation is having time and go a little bit deeper. Less so on the analytics, more on just what do we do? How do we get data? How do we communicate data? What are the key considerations for us? So we start, where do we begin? What are the data sources? So, the sectors that we keep bringing up, that justice development, homeless response system, healthcare, child welfare, Department of Education, all of the great suggestions that have happened over that continue to happen, in this room and over the last couple of days are part of the conversation around like bringing data sources together. One of the recommendations, and I don't actually steal my own thunder here, but the next step that we had was around building a data inventory and making sure that that is something that, is transparent and saying, this is where we're going to get our data. These are the partners that we're working with. This is the process that we're going to undertake to pull those data sources in. We talked a lot about how to develop success measures. I have a whole spiel on that. And we wanted to know, like, what is our vision of success, but then taking that vision of success and following it back from data source to specific data element, and then wondering, is that data quality? What are the perspectives that we need to bring in when we begin to analyze those data? How do we interpret it? How do we communicate it? So all of those were part of the conversation around creating a structure of performance that holds, that has principles around accountability, around transparency, and also where the onus isn't on people to change, but on the system to change. And so the performance measures are not about changing necessarily people's behavior, but really changing the system to account for specific and individual needs. And then we talked a lot about matching to analysis. So how do we do matching? What are the parameters? What are the ethical concerns around sharing data that are identifiable? We talked a lot about data equity. I'm gonna shout out a really wonderful organization called We All Count. They have a fabulous data equity framework that I put forward as guiding principles for us, and how lived experience and also racial equity needs to be brought in every single stage of that process, and then planning for specific steps how to do that, and then of course scaling beyond the data, beyond cues. So taking what we've learned about data, what we've learned about matching, what we've learned about the systems, and applying it in other venues for us. So we had a number of people from across the community, both in government, in homeless response, in law enforcement, in justice involved systems, in VA healthcare, and it was just like, oh, can we just take what we learned and apply it to my work? Yes, absolutely. Like the strategies and the learning that we have here from Fuse is absolutely, there's a great comment around like, is Fuse supposed to do systems change? You know, is it going to be the fuse that lights the fire around systems change? Yes, absolutely. And so what we learn here and what we do shouldn't stop at Fuse. It should be applied throughout the community. Oh, I got it. Oh, it's just this thing here. So as far as next steps, inventorying data sources, elements, point people. This has worked in a number of our communities in which we have been involved with Fuse. It's a great idea, and it makes things so much easier because we're able to delegate. Mapping data sources, agreements, and sharing a lot of just exploration and documentation here. So not so much data analysis quite yet. A data dictionary across systems for common terms. We went through that in the system modeling process, where we come to the same understanding, or at least a similar understanding. And if they're different, then we know that they're different. But at least we have a dictionary across systems for those common terms, so we know who we're talking about when we talk about data. We want to complete that matching, conduct a more robust analysis and sharing that out to the community for which might include, you know, the system cost utilization we talked about, and also the program benefits. We wanted to explore options for the statewide data warehouse project. So there's a lot of excitement around that, and how it can be leveraged in the Fuse project as well as in other venues. And then finally, and most importantly, centering equity and diversity perspectives, particularly focusing in on those data equity project steps, and incorporating strategies and approaches that value perspective and respect the perspectives that aren't in the room, and to go into them. Great. What's missing?
Now I know y'all aren't all of a sudden quiet on data.
There's a few people typing. If anyone wants to chat. How can information be disseminated to nonprofits and non-governmental organizations? Absolutely. One of the final steps of the data equity process is communication. And it's one of, you know, they're all equally important. It's perhaps the most important. We talked also about the responsibility of the data work group, the responsibility to community around data literacy and educating the community about what data are shown, and allowing the community to also come to conclusions on their own with guidance to make sure that that everyone is understanding what's being put forward. So it's not fair. I did it to the data group, so I can say it's not fair. But I showed, you know, a table we did an activity around analysis. And when I was working on it this morning, I was talking about, you know, I had on there the 90th percentile. I'm like, I really don't have to explain what the 90th percentile is. It's really about knowing your audience and knowing, you know, what is appropriate to share, and how can we help provide the right framing, and have folks ask additional questions for us to go back and do analysis after analysis and come forward with more information.
Yeah, and that came up in our priorities and planning session earlier today too,
Yeah.
when we were talking about data infrastructure. And there was some comments about like that data can be, can be so hard to
Yeah.
read. And so I think that that's definitely a strategy that I think is just like would be well received across the board and outside of it was something that came up pretty significantly in our conversation earlier.
And I would just say that from a data equity standpoint, it shouldn't be at the end that we consider those things. It really should be at the very beginning. From motivation, like why are we doing this? How the projects are designed, how data are collected, how data are analyzed, how they're interpreted, and how they're presented. All along the way should be a feedback loop between between interested parties across the community, and inclusive of the particularly of the people for whom the data are collected. Yeah. Mike's on the way.
This actually brings me back to a conversation I previously had with these collaboratories. So my role with these collaboratory, I'm like a private consultant. I share my experiences and they kind of work with me off of what I provide. And one of the people asked me what my experience was with data equity, and I told them my experience with it, but I also told them like I'm kind of new to this stuff, so I don't really know. But you brought up a really good point in organization about like data equity and stuff. And I feel like that's a really good opportunity to like collaborate and share that these collaboratories, because they're like trying to work on data equity on a national scale, but using our example on a community-based scale could really help be a good like reflection and opportunity to step forward.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, for additional resources, we all count is really, really wonderful. But there's also other ones like Designing for Justice. Like there's a network of data analysts across the country, across actually the world. It's called Designing for Justice. Really wonderful network, and they have fabulous resources that you can check out too. I saw one kind of scroll by about I think it was like compassion or kindness. And I think that's important, and it's so hard. It's so easy to forget, especially when you're looking at numbers all day, day in, day out, that numbers represent people and represent perspective and story, and have to be just respected and treated with care. And so empathy and data absolutely go together. And there is a role for kindness and empathy in data and data analysis. So I really appreciate that comment, because absolutely that's a great thing to do. And then the last piece we did, Brooke led a wonderful conversation around services and housing this morning. And some of the themes that came forward were from tenancy to pre-tenancy. How are the supports that are provided along the way need to meet people where they're at and need to be substantial and effective enough to fully support someone. And so we talked about like an ideal journey, given the most given a robust system, what does that look like? What's missing? It was a good exercise to determine, what other systems need to be incorporated, what supports and approaches have to be considered. Outreach was one of the major ones we heard also this afternoon. I caught some of the tail end around mobile services. There was some comments in the back around people are now at this moment in crisis, and so it doesn't necessarily start at tenancy. It starts way before, and the planning for that. They talked about goals and objectives. There was another conversation around home ownership yesterday that happened. Is that something that for someone is something that they want for themselves? That should happen, maybe not day one, but week one, month one. That should be part of the conversation. What are long-term goals? So I thought that was a really wonderful discussion. We talked about service design, provision, and coordination of services, something to be flexible and also have comprehensive care. And that included MCO, managed care organization, Medicaid organizations, include providers in the homeless response sector, but also included, and I really love this, that we talked about flexibility of funding and having funding that is unrestricted so that it can be used to barrier bust is also what they call it, but like things that maybe government doesn't traditionally pay for, or there's resources out there for, having some unrestricted funding. And it was brought up as like philanthropy. And someone, I think, someone had a really great insight. It's like, but also government, and that it's not philanthropy's sole responsibility to provide unrestricted funding, but also government has a role there too. And I thought that was really wonderful. We talked about pulling systems together. This was a core theme, I think, throughout the previous 2 days. All the systems that we've generated through our ideas and thoughts through Fuse can be brought together. And how is that done on inReach for institutional settings and also outreach in the community, people who are right now, this moment, experiencing crisis. And then that led into a conversation around on-site and mobile service provision. And of course, our system values for LISA. So there's some proposed system values around being person-centered and choice-focused, on respecting data privacy and secure and ensuring security, being trauma-informed. And so those are just a couple of samples for our proposed values for LISA. And of course, community. Particularly from the conversation yesterday that was brought up, is that people are in community now. And so it's important as people are housed, to ensure that the community isn't broken. So some of the next steps that we talked about, reaching out to providers and organizations to obtain commitment and buy-in from a multi-sectored approach, exploring additional referral networks for inReach and outreach opportunities. Again, this mapping and inventorying of current resources and conducting a gaps analysis around what's missing and what is not to our standard. Leveraging data sharing agreements. Data was another common theme throughout this entire forum. And then also coming back to this part about communication, but a strategy around presenting to leaders in the community. And that includes all of us, frankly, are considered leaders in the community. And so that's part of that strategy, is to present not only to political leadership, but also leadership that exists currently in this room. And then lastly, to discuss releases of information. That is, how can those be coordinated so that it's a much more streamlined and a straightforward way of obtaining consent, informed consent, and allowing people that are going through these systems to have agency over their own data, and opportunities to apply that in a multi-sectored approach. So it's like, my thought was like, when I came to mind, maybe it's different, but in my mind, it was like one thing for everything. Okay, what do we miss?
I know it's like this little shot in the dark with like advanced technology and stuff, but I feel like it would be a good opportunity to like have like a training where like everyone in the room is like homeless for a day, like not like literally, but like a work group where everyone is like mentally homeless for a day, and they have a piece of paper in front of them, like, oh, what would their approach be? And then they gather the results and then they apply that. Because I feel like not enough people that don't have the lived experience of homelessness ask themselves, what would I do if I was homeless? What does homelessness look like if I was homeless? Like, I feel like putting ourselves in those shoes, but not actually like living it. I feel like that could be a really good opportunity to like at least simulate the lived experience and have like a feel for it, instead of just like assuming what it is and trying to build upon that. Like, I feel like there should be more training about like actually like what would you do if you were to live that experience, and what would the process look like, especially for the people who aren't or who have never experienced homelessness. I feel like that would be a good idea to get like from like a privilege standpoint what their approach would be compared to those with lived experience, to share what their actual approach was and compare the two and then structure it off of that. Thank you.
There's a number of simulations out there where you kind of walk through it on a day, and you get sort of random assignments you have to go to get resources, sign up for food, whatever. It can be very powerful. Very powerful.
And in my mind, it speaks to empathy. Like, empathy by definition is just being able to imagine yourself in someone else's position and I think the exercise is great. I think it's a great idea, and we can have empathy without going through a large training, and so more empathy. I love that.
All right, so we have a few little, things that we put as a tentative timeline. Some of the next steps that came out of our working groups and our TPCH planning groups, right? Wrapping up August and going into September, right? Really establishing those working group meetings, right? What is the cadence of those meetings? How are we going to get those scheduled, and really kind of working to develop those agendas. Really thinking about that coalition building network. Like, we've had some really wonderful conversations today, and this has been a really wonderful and diverse group that's participated very meaningfully over the last couple of days. But we also kind of felt like there's still some coalition building, some networking that still needs to be happening. And kind of going through and continuing to recruit and identify who are going to be those champions, right? As we launch this work into the community, how are we going to sort of continue to engage those champions who can really help us do this work effectively together? In October, we're thinking that's when we would be able to have sort of a landscape and market analyses for the community, right? Getting some of those draft budgets, right? It's going to be hard to sort of go through and make these asks if we don't have some of that financial modeling and some of those things put together. So continuing to do that data analyses as well to really help us hone in on what are we talking about? What is going to be that need? Then following that, we're gonna we were talking about doing some information sessions, right? That some of our work groups really felt like we needed to still kind of continue to go out into the community and with other groups that aren't weren't here today or may not be part of this work on a regular basis, and really kind of go out and continue to share that information. And then also, of course, this data, these releases of information, thinking about how do we continue that conversation and work on that sort of shared release of information in coordination and in partnership with other existing efforts that are already happening. And then thinking about those referral networks, both for outreach and inreach, as Ian mentioned when that came out of the housing and services conversation. So this is a good start to some of your work together, and you really have done an incredible amount of work over the last 2 days to really fill out and provide so much incredible feedback and input into these priorities and into how we might engage on this work together. So, questions. All right, so let's see. If we go in for we need to bring services to them. Yeah. So could I get some clarification? Is this just sort of like making sure that folks aren't being released into homelessness? Do we need to, yeah, I think that's definitely part of what we've been talking about. How do we become a youth project champion?
The good news is you already are. So, but to act on it, it's to bring in the spaces and circles that you in which you move, right, from work to your personal networks. Talk these up. Share what you've learned. It's as easy as that.
But make sure we're linking it back to these work groups, right?
Yeah.
Because, and then the work groups also need to be carrying back, right? This sort of, this full circle of feedback loops of work, right? So that the great work is happening and it's being shared out. Great work's happening out in the community, it's being shared back in, so that these work groups really have, the full picture and that we're really able to you know, have that feedback loop closed, right? So that we're not kind of doing, again, going back into these silos. Yeah.
Speak on the Arizona 211 thing. I know like a while, it was long, it was a long while back, but I brought up a suggestion to like update Arizona 211's website to have like a map or like the visual like map of like pinpoints where like there's like open shelters with availability to kitchens that are open and stuff, or like just having like a living, breathing like interface that at-risk folks can use to navigate resources. And a lot of people suggested Arizona 211, but I remember when I was homeless and I tried to navigate Arizona 211, most of the numbers and organizations that I called were either at capacity, the organization or program didn't exist. They were no longer accepting new people. So I still do agree that Arizona 211 is an amazing resource, but I also feel like it could do some work in updating too.
Great feedback. Yeah, continued support for people who are currently housed. It's really, that's a really great point.
Hi, my name is Stuart. I'm a homeowner. I'm not a member of a community organization or anything. I'm actually coming here this afternoon and hopefully getting some resources, so that I can call when there are homeless people around their neighborhood, little grandkids, and I like to see some of the things that go on. But I'm hoping to get some additional resources. But one of the things I didn't see, maybe because I thought today, was the business community. And I'm from Los Angeles, and we had a number of resources that businesses can call to hire folks that were homeless, or in programs. Because one of the things that we saw was that, and I was a business that I actually hired somebody for a long period of time before I retired. But involving the business community and teaching people how to find work and coaching people, there's a lot of, it's obviously a different employment time now than it was a number of years ago, no matter where we are. But teaching people how to find work, teaching people how to keep jobs, teaching people how to maintain their homes, so that when you're in a residence, they know what happened, who to call, or whatever else. So I'd love to see you more involved with the business community, and again, teaching people, educating people on how to find work, how to keep jobs, and how to maintain the residence.
I think that the outreach to the business community is definitely something that is part of this strategy. And it's definitely come up quite a bit. You're in a room full of folks that can give you all kinds of resources. So you came to the right place. So we certainly, again, want to thank you all so much for this work. We'll be providing all of this back to TPCH, to the city, and so you'll certainly have all of that.
Margaret, I just wanted to say hi, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Brooke Page. I'm the director for CSH Southwest Geography, and working with Margaret and Ian on the Peace Initiative. And I just wanted to thank Margaret. Margaret's transitioning from CSH, but the work that has been done this year is just remarkable. A lot of behind the scenes coordination that's happened with the city and the county, and a lot of the community partners. You all have an investment, and you've got the momentum that started, and we've got community in this room that care so much about our unhoused neighbors and the work. And so we just want you all to know that, you know, as the work continues, CSH is a support and a resource to show you examples, to provide support and resources.
that we are aware of, so you all can continue to move this work forward. And so I just want to thank Margaret and Ian so much for the coordination and the effort today and yesterday. And just thank you all for your commitment.
We're done.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like moving around. I was like forcing you to.